In this lesson, we will learn how to use custom fonts in our web pages. So for example, we as designers may have fonts installed on our computers that we love, and we may want to use those fonts in our web pages. However, if a visitor of our website does not also have that font installed, they will not see that font, and instead their web browser will fall back to use a system default font. Well, in this lesson, we will learn how to sidestep that limitation by embedding font files into our web pages in a way that browsers can easily download and use. And this will allow us to use any font in our web pages that we have the proper licensing to use. Let's get started. There are different approaches to embedding font files into your pages, but I think they can all be broken down into two categories. The first category we will call hosted solutions. Examples of this would be Adobe's Typekit or Google Fonts. These services will provide you with a code snippet that you can copy and then paste into the head section of your website. These services will do all of the heavy lifting, and the code that they give you to paste into your head section will reference files that live on their server. So then literally all that you will need to do is use the font name in your font family CSS declarations. Now these hosted font solutions are so easy to use, we're not going to cover them in this lesson because really there's nothing to review. Now the second category we will call self-hosted fonts. This is where the font files live on our server and we need to manage those files and link to those files in our CSS code. It's a little bit more tricky, so the rest of this lesson is going to be reviewing that process. Let's dive right in. There is a font named PT Sans that I enjoy using in my designs. It's a freely available font and its license lets anyone use it on their pages. So I downloaded the PT Sans font from a website named Font Squirrel. Now typically when you download a font, it will include a regular version, a bold version, an italic version, and a bold italic version. Let's begin with the regular non-bold, non-italic version. Now you can see that there are 4 files, and you may be wondering why isn't there just one file? All 4 of these are the same exact identical font. However, different web browsers and different devices need different formats. So we can see that these 4 files have the same name, pt-sans, but this one ends in EOT, this one ends in .svg, .ttf, .woff. So if you have a font that you're licensed to use, and let's imagine that you only have the TTF version, you'll need to find a web font generator that can automatically convert that file into all of these different formats. I recommend you perform a web search for Font Squirrel and then look for the web font generator page. So once we've chosen a font and we have the 4 most popular file formats for the font, we need to move these files into the same folder as where our web page lives. So this is where our example page lives, index.html. This is the example page we've seen in earlier lessons. And we know that we have a CSS folder with our CSS file. Now, in order to stay organized, I'm going to create a folder within our CSS folder named Fonts. And I'm going to move over the PT Sans font files into this newly created Fonts folder. With these files in place, let's hop over to the text editor and begin writing a bit of CSS code. So I will create a commented section to stay organized. Custom fonts. So all of our custom font code will be placed between this line and this line. So the first thing we're going to do is include the @ sign and then font face. Now this code syntax looks like a typical CSS rule that we've seen in the course. However, this is not a traditional selector. We're not selecting anything on the page to style. Instead, we are defining a font. So within the brackets, we'll say font family, PT Sans, or whatever the name of your font is. On the next line of code, source. This is where we point the web browser to those font files that we just moved in to the newly created fonts folder. The first file that I will link to is the WOFF, the WOFF extension, because it's the most upcoming emerging font standard. So I'll copy and paste this name instead of having to remember the exact spelling. URL, quotes. We will begin by typing the name of the folder that we know the file lives in. We know that it lives in the fonts subfolder. So fonts and then / and then we'll paste in the name of the file. Then outside of these parentheses, we'll say format, and we know that the format is WAF. Finally, we know that this is not the bold or the italic version. This is just the normal standard version. So we'll say font weight is normal, and font style is not italic, but it's just normal. With this code in place, and with the font file in place, we can now use this font name, PT Sans, in our CSS. So our body element is currently telling the page to use the Georgia font, which we can see here. But let's remove this and take our PT Sans font for a spin. PT Sans, if that's not available for some reason, maybe the download fails, we'll use Arial. If that's not available, we'll use the system default sans serif font. Now before we save and refresh, I should point out that this code where we're defining the font and pointing to the font files, this should actually be placed before we reference the font name. So I'm just going to cut and paste that code to sit at the top of our style sheet. So if we save and refresh, you can see that the browser is now successfully using the custom font. However, our job is not complete, because even though this font will work in the newest version of Firefox and the newest version of Chrome, older browsers and other touchscreen devices will not be able to load the WOFF version. So this is where the code gets a little bit trickier. We now need to link to these other 3 formats as well in our code. So instead of boring you with this code, I'm just going to paste it in and explain it. We now have 2 source declarations. The first simply links to the EOT version of the font, and this is for Internet Explorer 9. Our second source declaration has paths to all 4 font formats. So this will work in older versions of Internet Explorer. This is the WAF version that will work in the latest browsers and devices. TTF, which will work in slightly older devices, and SVG, which will work for certain touchscreen or mobile devices. Now, in this second source declaration, where we're linking to multiple formats, after we're done pointing the browser to one file, we simply include a comma, and then we can link to the next file, so on and so forth. So we now have rock-solid support for this font. This will work in the widest range of browsers and devices. However, we've only set up the regular version of the font. What if we want the font to be bold or italic? You will see in the page that the web browser is trying to make the text bold here, it's trying to make the text italic here, and it's trying to make the text both bold and italic here. But if you zoom in and look very closely, you can tell that it doesn't look quite right. This is because the web browser is trying to use the base regular font, and it's artificially manipulating the font to be bold or italic. That's not ideal. We want to provide a dedicated font file that a font designer has created to appear bold or to appear italic. So all we need to do is add additional font face rules in our style sheet for the different bold and italic variations. First, let's add the bold font. So here are our font files that are in the website directory. Here are all of the font files that we downloaded. So here's the bold folder. So I'm just going to move over the bold files in all of the different formats. Now we need to link to those new bold files in our style sheet. So we'll create a new font face rule, font family. We want it to be the exact same name, PT Sans. Only we're going to include different source files now. Now instead of boring you by typing in all of this code, I'm going to paste in a bit of code, and it's simply pointing to the new bold files that we just moved into the folder. Now the key to our new rule is to make sure that we specify that this is font weight bold and font style normal. So this font face rule is very similar to the first one that we created, except we're pointing towards different files that are the bold files, and then we're specifying that it's bold but not italic. So now, if we save and refresh, I want you to look very closely to this text that I'm highlighting. Now, through a video file, you may not be able to see the difference, or the change might have been very subtle. But believe me, if you're using a high-quality screen to view a web page, you will see the difference. The font is much smoother, and it's a very beautiful, bold effect. So all that remains now is that we need to do the same thing for italic and bold italic text. So all that I'm going to do is find the place that we downloaded the files to, and I'm just going to move over the files for italic and move over the files for bold italic. So this folder is quite messy. Let me clean it up a bit. So now we're just going to head over to our CSS and create 2 additional font face rules, one for italic and one for bold italic. Font face. I will paste in the source lines in just a moment, but let's get the skeleton set up first. Font family. We want the same name, PT Sans. Font weight normal, but font style italic. And then we want one that is both font weight bold and font style italic. So at this point now, I will just paste in the relevant source lines. Here are the lines for the italic, and here are the lines for the bold italic. So if we save and refresh, pay attention to this text and this text. They look quite a bit better. And that concludes the process of embedding custom fonts into your style sheets. Feel free to apply custom fonts however you see fit. Maybe you want to leave a traditional font like Arial for the baseline text and then only use your custom fonts for headings. It's up to you. You are also free to include as many different custom fonts as you would like. However, I will include the 2 following warnings. Number 1, the more font files you embed, the longer it will take your visitors to download all of the files. And number 2, many wise graphic designers have gone on the record to say that the fewer fonts you use in a design, the better. But there is no objective right or wrong way to approach typography. Have fun, and I will see you in the next lesson.